In the quiet countryside stood a village people rarely visited. Surrounded by dense forests and silent fields, it looked peaceful from the outside. But anyone who lived there knew that beneath its calm surface lay a history no one wanted to talk about. Stories whispered through generations spoke of disappearances, strange lights in the graveyard, and a night when screams had once filled the air. But when questions were asked, the villagers always gave the same response: silence. Lee, a young woman who had grown up in the city, came to the village after inheriting her grandmother's house. She expected a fresh start, a quiet place to heal from the stress of her old life. The villagers welcomed her politely, but there was a coldness in their eyes, as if they were measuring how much she might discover. One evening, as she walked past the graveyard, Lee noticed something unusual. The soil around a certain row of graves seemed freshly disturbed, as if someone had been digging. But there were no flowers, no signs of mourning, only uneven earth under the moonlight. She mentioned it to her neighbor the next morning, but he quickly changed the subject, muttering, "Best not to linger near the old graves." The more people avoided her questions, the more Lee's curiosity grew. She began asking about the cemetery's history, but the answers were always vague. Some said a fire had swept through the village long ago, others hinted at a sickness. Yet no one spoke directly. It was as if the truth had been buried deeper than the graves themselves. One night, while lying awake, Lee heard whispers. At first, she thought it was the wind through the trees, but as she listened, she realized the voices were clearer, almost like words. Heart pounding, she went to the window. The sound came from the direction of the graveyard. Against her better judgment, she slipped on a coat and walked into the night. The cemetery was eerily still. Fog curled between the stones, and the moon cast pale light across the crooked crosses. The whispers grew louder, and this time she could make out sentences. "Why did you leave us? Tell them the truth. The fire was no accident." Lee froze, her breath caught in her throat. She ran back home, slamming the door shut, trying to convince herself it was imagination. But the voices echoed in her mind long after the night ended. Determined to understand, she searched her grandmother's house the next day. In the attic, hidden under old trunks, she found a box of letters. The handwriting was shaky and the paper yellowed with age. The letters spoke of strange events decades earlier, children disappearing, officials covering it up, and villagers too afraid to speak out. One letter ended with a chilling line: "They buried the truth in those graves, but one day the dead will not stay silent." Lee felt a shiver crawl down her spine. The next night the whispers returned. This time they were louder. She pressed her ear against the wall, trembling. "Lee!" One of the voices called clearly. "Lee, you must listen." Her grandmother had once told her bedtime stories about restless souls. At the time, Lee thought they were only tales meant to scare children, but now she wondered if those stories were warnings. The following morning, Lee tried once again to talk to her neighbors. She mentioned the letters, hoping someone would finally tell her the truth. Instead, their faces turned pale. An older woman grabbed her wrist and whispered sharply, "Don't dig into this. The dead should be left alone." "But they're not alone," Lee answered. "They're speaking." The woman's grip tightened before she let go, her eyes full of fear. "Then it's already starting again." That phrase haunted Lee for the rest of the day. Starting again? What had happened before? And why was it happening now that she had arrived? That night, Lee sat awake, determined not to run this time. When the voices came, she closed her eyes and listened. The whispers blended into one. "We were betrayed. Tell our story, justice." Lee whispered back, barely believing her own voice. "What do you want me to do?" The air turned cold, and the whisper came sharper than ever. "Dig." Her stomach twisted with dread. Dig where? At the cemetery, in her grandmother's yard, somewhere else entirely. She didn't know. But one thing was clear: the truth had been buried, and now the dead were calling her to uncover it. Lee realized that her peaceful life in the countryside was a lie. She hadn't inherited a home, she had inherited a secret, and the secret was waking up. The dead were no longer silent. Lee could not sleep. The voices from the graveyard echoed in her head, repeating the same word: dig. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw shadows of figures with pale faces and hollow eyes, pointing toward the cemetery. By morning, her body felt weak, but her mind was restless. She needed answers. She went back to the attic to reread the letters she had found. One in particular caught her attention. It was dated nearly 50 years earlier, written by her grandmother. It described how several villagers had vanished in 1 week. No bodies were found, no funerals held. The officials at the time claimed the victims had left the village during an outbreak of sickness, but the writer hinted otherwise. "They told us to keep quiet, but I saw where they carried the bodies at night. They buried them where no prayers were said." Lee's hands shook. The cemetery was the only place that matched this description. Her grandmother had known something, but instead of telling Lee directly, she had left these cryptic warnings behind. That evening, Lee packed a small shovel, a flashlight, and gloves. She knew how foolish it sounded, but her instincts told her she couldn't ignore the command of the whispers. At midnight, she slipped out of her house and walked to the cemetery. The graveyard loomed larger at night. The fog was thicker, the trees groaned as though alive, and the stones looked like crooked teeth in the earth. She stood in front of the row of disturbed graves she had noticed earlier. Her heart thudded in her chest. The voices came again, low and urgent. Here, here. She knelt down and pushed the shovel into the soil. The ground was damp, heavy, and cold. Every strike of the shovel seemed to echo through the silent night. Sweat ran down her face despite the chill. After a few feet of digging, her shovel hit something solid. She froze, breath catching. Carefully, she scraped away the soil. What she uncovered was not a coffin. It was a wooden crate sealed shut with rusted nails. Lee's hands trembled as she pried it open. Inside were bones, human bones, skulls, ribs, fragments of clothing. She gasped, nearly dropping the flashlight. These weren't official burials. This was a dumping ground, a mass grave. The whispers grew louder, circling her. They hit us. Tell them, tell the world. Lee staggered back, horrified. The villagers hadn't just kept secrets. They had buried entire lives in silence. And yet, if these were the missing people from her grandmother's letters, then everything the officials had claimed was a lie. There had been no sickness, only murder, betrayal, or something far worse. She ran home, shaking, her mind spinning. She wanted to tell someone, but who? The neighbors had warned her to stop digging. If she went to the authorities, would they believe her? Or were they part of the cover-up too? The next morning, Lee's exhaustion showed on her face, but she forced herself into the village market, hoping to test the waters. She carefully mentioned that she had gone to the cemetery and found something strange. Instantly, conversations around her went silent. An older man leaned close and hissed, "You should have never gone there." His hands gripped her arm with surprising strength. Once the dead start speaking, there's no stopping them. Leave before it's too late. Too late for what? Lee asked, pulling back. He didn't answer. He simply walked away, his eyes haunted. That evening, Lee sat with the letters spread around her like puzzle pieces. She traced her grandmother's words with her finger. "They told us to be silent, but silence is poison. Someday, someone will come who can hear them." Lee whispered aloud, "Was that someone me?" The reply came instantly, a cold breath against her ear, though no one was there. "Yes." She jumped, nearly knocking the lamp over. Her house felt suddenly crowded, as if unseen figures filled the corners. The air grew heavy and faint voices repeated, "Justice, justice, justice." Her fear mixed with determination. She could not run from this. She had already uncovered the first secret, the mass grave. But why were these people killed? Who buried them? And why had the entire village agreed to stay silent for half a century? The only person who might have left more clues was her grandmother. Lee searched through drawers, journals, anything she could find. At the bottom of an old wardrobe, she discovered a locked box. The key was missing, but she smashed the lock open. Inside were photographs, black and white pictures of villagers from decades ago. In several of them, Lee noticed groups standing near the cemetery. Faces stared back at her, some familiar from older villagers she had seen. On the back of one photo was a note in her grandmother's handwriting. "The council knows." They were there. Lee's blood ran cold. The village leaders hadn't just known, they had been part of it. Suddenly, the whispers surged again, almost shouting now. "Don't trust them. They killed us. You must reveal it." Lee clutched the photos to her chest. She finally understood. This wasn't only about restless spirits. It was about truth that had been silenced by those in power. And if the council had been involved back then, perhaps their descendants were still guarding the secret now. She sat in the darkness of her grandmother's house, the weight of the dead pressing down on her. She had opened the door. There was no turning back. The dead had chosen her, and their story was only beginning to surface. Lee spent the next day walking around the village, photographs hidden in her bag, the voices of the dead still murmuring in her ears. She didn't know if others could hear them or if she alone had been chosen as their messenger. But every time she passed an elder, every time someone from the council looked at her, the whispers sharpened. "They know. They hit us. Beware." At dusk, she finally gathered enough courage to go to the town hall. It was a plain stone building that looked harmless from the outside, but its silence felt heavy, like the air before a storm. Inside, the council members sat around a long wooden table. 5 of them, all elderly, their faces carved with lines, their eyes sharp and watchful. Lee introduced herself and mentioned that she had been going through her grandmother's belongings. She chose her words carefully. "I've found letters and photographs. They suggest something happened here long ago, something about people who disappeared." The room stiffened. One councilman cleared his throat and said flatly, "Old stories, nothing more." Lee pulled one of the photographs from her bag and placed it on the table. The black and white image showed several figures, recognizable even in youth, standing near the cemetery. She tapped the back where her grandmother had written, "The council knows." The air in the room seemed to freeze. An older woman leaned forward, her voice low but sharp. "You should not have those." Lee forced herself to meet their eyes. "The dead are speaking. They don't want silence anymore." The council members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, the oldest man, finally spoke. His voice shook, not with weakness, but with the weight of memory. "Child, you don't understand what you've stepped into. Those people, they were sacrificed for the good of the village. We did what had to be done." Lee's stomach dropped. "Sacrificed? You mean murdered?" The man slammed his hand on the table, startling her. "You think you know better than us? You weren't here when the sickness came. You weren't here when the outsiders tried to destroy us. Choices had to be made." The whispers rose instantly in Lee's ears, a storm of furious voices. Lies, betrayal, justice. She pressed her palms against the table. "I saw the mass grave. I dug it open. Don't tell me it was for the village's good. These people were silenced, and now they're demanding the truth." The woman on the council leaned closer, her eyes glinting. "Then you've doomed us all. If they've started speaking to you, it means the seal is broken. They will not stop until they are avenged." Lee's chest tightened. "Seal? What seal?" The council exchanged glances again, but no one answered. Instead, the man barked. "You will destroy those photographs and letters. You will stop your digging, and you will leave the dead where they belong." Lee stood up, her hands shaking but her voice steady. "No, if you won't speak the truth, I will." She gathered her things and walked out, ignoring the heavy stares that followed her. Outside, the night had fallen thick and fast, the streets unusually empty. Lee clutched her bag tightly as she hurried home. Every shadow seemed alive, every whisper of wind carried a voice. "Don't stop," the dead urged. "Reveal them, justice." Back in her grandmother's house, Lee collapsed into a chair, her heart pounding. Her mind reeled with the word the councilwoman had used, seal. What had they bound? Were the dead being kept silent by some ritual? And now, by digging, had she broken whatever barrier existed? She didn't have time to ponder long. A knock sounded at the door. When she opened it, she found the same older woman from the council standing there alone. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together. "I shouldn't be here," the woman whispered. "If the others knew, they'd cast me out, but you must understand. We were young then. We were told lies, too. They said the ones buried were dangerous, cursed. But the truth is they were innocent." Her voice broke. "And we let it happen." Lee's chest ached. "Why didn't you stop them?" Tears filled the woman's eyes. "Because fear is stronger than courage, and fear ruled this village." She grabbed Lee's hand suddenly, her grip trembling. "But now that they've chosen you, there is no turning back. They will keep speaking louder and louder, and if you don't give them peace, they will take their justice themselves." Lee's skin crawled. "What do you mean?" The woman's eyes darted to the darkness outside. "Watch the graves, you'll see." Then she slipped away into the night, leaving Lee with more questions than answers. That night, Lee lit every candle in the house and sat awake, clutching the photographs. The whispers returned, but this time they weren't just voices. She heard scraping sounds like earth being pushed aside. She rushed to the window, her heart in her throat. The cemetery lay in the distance, fog rolling heavy over it. But in the moonlight, she saw it, shadows rising slowly from the ground, dragging themselves free from the soil. Figures bent and broken, their faces hollow, but their eyes burning with something that wasn't life. Lee's breath caught in her throat. The dead weren't just whispering anymore. They were walking. The first time Lee saw the shadows clawing their way from the graves, she thought her mind was playing tricks. But as the fog thinned, there was no denying it. The dead were rising. Figures wrapped in soil and tattered remnants of clothes pulled themselves upright, their bones creaking, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. She pressed her hands to the glass, her breath fogging the window. Every part of her wanted to run, but she couldn't move. It was as if her body understood something her mind had not yet accepted. The whispers had not been lies. The dead had been waiting, and now they were awake. The voices thundered in her skull, no longer soft but commanding. "See us, tell them justice." Lee backed away from the window, heart hammering. The candle flames flickered violently, as if reacting to the presence outside. She grabbed the photographs and letters and shoved them into a bag. Her instincts screamed that she couldn't stay in the house. The dead weren't coming for her, but they were going to the village. She stepped out into the cold night, her boots crunching against the frost. The cemetery was alive with motion, dozens of shadowy figures dragging themselves toward the narrow road that led into the heart of the village. Some limped, some crawled, but they all moved with the same purpose. Lee hid behind a tree, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The air reeked of damp soil and decay. She thought they might attack her, but the figures passed without glancing her way. Instead, their hollow eyes fixed ahead, toward the houses, toward the people who had buried them. The first screams pierced the night minutes later. Lee crept closer, hiding among the trees as the dead reached the village square. Windows burst open, lanterns lit, and villagers stumbled into the streets, horrified by the sight. The council members rushed out too, their faces pale. The dead didn't speak with mouths. mouths. Their voices rattled the air, echoing like thunder. You buried us, you lied, you silenced us, now you will hear. Panic spread instantly. Some villagers fell to their knees, begging for mercy. Others tried to run, but the fog grew so thick it trapped them like walls. The councilmen shouted orders, telling everyone to stay calm, but their voices shook. Lee's blood boiled as she listened. For years, these people had lived in peace while the dead lay hidden beneath their feet. Now the silence was broken, and truth came crawling from the earth. One of the dead figures stepped forward, taller than the rest. His skull was cracked, but his presence commanded attention. His voice boomed, "You burned us, you buried us, and you swore an oath of silence." Lee gasped. Burned? Her grandmother's letters had spoken of a fire, but no details. Now she understood. The fire had not been an accident. It had been part of the cover-up. The villagers screamed, denying it, but the council members stood frozen. Their silence was louder than any confession. Lee's courage finally overpowered her fear. She stepped into the square, holding the photographs high. "I know the truth," she shouted. "I've seen the graves, I've read the letters. My grandmother tried to warn me. They killed you and buried the truth." Every head turned toward her. The living stared in shock, the dead in grim approval. The tall figure pointed a bony hand at her. "She hears us. She will speak for us." The councilman who had yelled at her earlier snarled, his voice cracking. "You don't know what you're saying, girl. They were cursed. We had to protect the village." The crowd of dead shook their heads in unison, their hollow voices rising in a roar. "Lies, innocent blood, we demand justice." The ground trembled under Lee's feet. She felt as though the earth itself was listening, waiting for her answer. She held the photographs tighter. "Then I'll tell the world," she said, her voice breaking but steady. "I'll tell everyone what you did." The tall figure turned its hollow gaze on the council. "Truth or torment, choose." The villagers began crying, screaming for answers. Some shouted at the council, others begged the dead to forgive them. The council members, cornered by both the living and the dead, finally cracked. The woman who had come secretly to Lee's house the night before stepped forward. Her face was ashen, but she raised her hands. "It's true," she said hoarsely. "We burned them. We said it was sickness, but it was a lie. We were told they carried curses, that their blood would doom us. And so we killed them, every one of them." Gasps and cries erupted from the villagers. The dead groaned in unison, a terrible, sorrowful sound. Lee's heart clenched. Innocent people had been slaughtered, their memory erased. The tall figure spoke again. "Then let the living feel our silence." Suddenly, the square plunged into chaos. Lanterns exploded, plunging everything into darkness. The screams of villagers mixed with the howls of the dead. Lee was knocked to the ground, clutching her bag of evidence. All around her, shadows swirled like a storm. But in the middle of it, a single whisper brushed against her ear. "You are our voice. Do not fail us." The chaos lasted until dawn. When the light finally broke, the dead had vanished. The fog was gone, but the square was in ruins, and the villagers knelt on the ground, broken, terrified, muttering prayers. Lee stood trembling, her clothes dirty, her hands scraped. She knew the dead hadn't finished. They had risen not only for vengeance, but for truth, and they had chosen her to carry it. The silence of the dead was over, and now their justice had only begun. The morning after the dead rose, the village was broken. Windows shattered, streets torn, and faces pale with horror. The council gathered the people in the square, their voices trembling as they called for order. But no one listened. Whispers ran through the crowd like fire. The dead walked. The council confessed. "We are cursed." Lee stood at the edge, clutching her bag of photographs and letters. She felt the weight of every hollow gaze that had risen from the soil. Their whispers still lingered in her ears. "You are our voice. Do not fail us." She knew now that silence wasn't an option. As she turned to leave, a hand caught her arm. It was the councilwoman who had spoken to her in secret before. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot. "You cannot take this beyond the village," she hissed. "If you tell the outside world, they will destroy us all." Lee yanked her arm free. "You already destroyed yourselves, you destroyed them." The woman's lips trembled. "You don't understand. This village survives because of silence. If you speak, if the truth spreads, they won't stop at us. The dead will come for everyone who ignored their cries." But Lee shook her head. "No, they don't want silence anymore. They want justice. And the only way to give it to them is to let the truth be known." The woman's face hardened. "Then you are a fool, and fools don't live long here." Lee left quickly, her heart pounding. She went back to her grandmother's house, packed the most important evidence, the letters, the photographs, and one small piece of bone she had found near the mass grave. It was morbid, but she knew proof would matter more than words. She stuffed them into a suitcase, determined to leave. By afternoon, she was on the bus to the nearest city. As the vehicle rattled down the road, Lee finally breathed easier. She imagined herself arriving at a newsroom, handing over the letters, telling the story, and watching the world's shock. The dead would finally be vindicated. But the whispers followed her. Even in the bus with strangers around, she heard them. "Hurry, they will stop you, Justice waits." Her unease grew when she noticed a black car trailing behind the bus. It kept its distance, but it was there at every turn. She didn't need the whispers to tell her it was the council. When she arrived in the city, Lee went straight to a journalist she remembered reading years ago, a woman named Clara who specialized in exposing corruption. Clara listened carefully as Lee laid out the letters and photographs. Her eyes widened at the mass grave picture Lee had taken with her phone. "This," Clara said, leaning back in her chair, "is explosive. If this is true, if the council covered up mass killings, it's not just a local crime. It's a historic atrocity." Lee nodded. "It's true, I saw the bones myself. And the dead." She stopped. How could she explain what had happened without sounding insane? Clara studied her. "The dead what?" Lee hesitated, then whispered, "They rose, they're speaking, they want justice." Clara blinked. A silence stretched. Then instead of laughing, she leaned forward. "You're not the first person to say something like that, you know? Old villages, old crimes, they leave stains. Sometimes those stains bleed through." Lee's chest loosened with relief. Finally, someone who believed, or at least didn't dismiss her outright. They arranged to meet again the next morning to plan how to release the story. Lee left Clara's office feeling a surge of hope. The dead had trusted her, and now she was fulfilling her role. But as she walked back to her rented room, she sensed she was being followed. Every shadow seemed to move, every footstep behind her quickened when she did. She ducked into an alley and pressed against the wall. The black car she had seen earlier rolled past slowly, headlights dim. Her blood turned cold. The council hadn't let her go. That night she barely slept. The whispers grew louder, warning her. "They will silence you, protect the truth." Before dawn, a pounding at her door startled her awake. She froze, suitcase of evidence beside her. The pounding grew harder. "Lee," a man's voice barked. "Open the door, you don't understand what you're doing." She didn't answer. She grabbed her suitcase, shoved open the window, and climbed down the fire escape. Her heart pounded as she slipped into the dark street, the whispers guiding her. "Run, do not stop." By sunrise, Lee was hiding in a train station, clutching her suitcase to her chest. She felt hunted, caught between the living who wanted to bury the truth again and the dead who demanded it rise. As she sat on the cold bench, the loudspeaker echoed train departures, but in her ears another voice overlapped. "You are close, but they will strike soon. Be ready." Lee tightened her grip on the suitcase. She knew the final confrontation was coming. The truth had been buried once. Now it was fighting to stay alive through her. The train station was crowded, but Lee felt utterly alone. She clutched her suitcase of evidence so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The whispers of the dead filled her head, urging her on. "Justice, truth, do not fail us." She boarded the train just as the black car pulled up outside the station. Through the window, she saw two men step out, faces she recognized from the village council. Her heart pounded as the train lurched forward, leaving them behind. For the moment, she was safe. Hours later, she returned to Clara, the journalist, ready to hand over everything. Clara spread the letters and photos across her desk, her eyes wide. "This is it," she said. "This could be one of the biggest stories in decades." Lee nodded. "We have to release it now. The council already knows I've come here. They'll do anything to stop it." But even as she spoke, the lights in the office flickered. The air turned cold and the whispers filled the room. Clara shivered. "Do you hear that?" Lee closed her eyes. "Yes, they're here. The dead were restless. They didn't just want exposure. They wanted judgment." That night, Clara began preparing the story for publication, scanning documents, verifying details. But before dawn, the building's alarm blared. Lee and Clara rushed downstairs to find the front door shattered. The council's men had come. Lee grabbed her suitcase, pulling Clara with her through the back exit. They fled into the streets, chased by shadows of men and by something else. The fog had followed Lee from the village, curling through alleys, hiding shapes that didn't belong to the living. The dead were marching again. As the men closed in, the fog thickened. Out of it stepped the same tall figure Lee had seen in the graveyard, the one who had led the dead. His hollow gaze fell on the council's men. They froze, their bravado shattering. "Murderers," the figure thundered. "You buried us, now you will be buried in truth." The ground trembled. The men screamed as hands clawed out of the pavement, skeletal fingers dragging them down into the earth. Their cries were swallowed by the fog. Clara stared, trembling. "This is impossible." Lee held her arm. "It's justice." The whispers rose again, surrounding Lee. "You have carried us far, now speak. Let the world know." Clara looked at her. "If we publish this, everyone will know the truth. But once it's out, there's no undoing it. The whole country will look at that village, at those people, and they'll never escape the shame." Lee's hands shook. She thought of the councilwoman who had confessed in the square, of the villagers who had lived in fear for decades, of her grandmother who had left the warnings. And then she thought of the mass grave, the bones, the whispers that would not let her sleep. They don't want silence anymore, Lee said firmly. They want the truth, even if it destroys the village, even if it destroys me. With Clara's help, Lee recorded everything. She told the story of the fire, the lies, the mass grave. She showed the photographs and read the letters aloud. She described the night the dead rose and the council confessed. Clara uploaded the story, sending it to multiple outlets at once. By morning, it was everywhere. Headlines screamed about a forgotten massacre, a buried truth, a cursed village. Reporters swarmed the countryside. Authorities rushed to investigate. And the dead. For the first time, Lee felt silence in her head. No whispers, no commands, just peace. But peace did not mean safety. That evening, Lee returned to her room and found the councilwoman waiting. Her eyes were red from crying. "You've done it," the woman whispered. "The world knows, but do you realize what that means? The dead have their justice, but the living will suffer. This village will never recover. We will be remembered only for blood and betrayal." Lee met her gaze. Maybe that's the price of truth. The woman's lips trembled. She left without another word. Later that night, Lee dreamed. She stood once more in the graveyard. The tall figure approached her, but this time his eyes glowed softer. "You have spoken for us," he said. "The silence is broken. We may rest." One by one, the figures faded into the earth, their whispers dissolving into the night. When Lee awoke, the world outside was still buzzing with headlines. But inside her heart, there was quiet at last. She had carried the truth. She had given the dead their voice. And though the village would never be the same, neither would she. The truth, once buried, had risen, and it would never be silenced again.